All right, let's go. Number 10. Stonehenge's supply chain, and the mystery runs deeper than the stones. In 2005, archaeologist Mike Parker Pearson and his team were excavating the settlement site of Durrington Walls, a vast circular enclosure in Wiltshire, England, roughly 2 miles northeast of Stonehenge itself. They were searching for evidence of who had built the great monument and how those people had lived. What they found changed the scale of the question entirely. The excavation uncovered enormous quantities of animal bone cattle and pig remains in the tens of thousands, discarded in feasting middens around timber structures and open hearths. Analysis of the bone chemistry told a remarkable story. Some of those cattle had not come from Wiltshire at all. Isotope signatures in the teeth and bones indicated origins as far away as Scotland and northeast England, meaning live animals, or at minimum freshly slaughtered carcasses, had been moved across the entire breadth of the British Isles to reach this single gathering place around 2500 BCE. The distance involved is not a short drove road. It is a journey of hundreds of miles through terrain, with no roads, no written schedules, and no state administration of any recognizable kind. That is the number that deserves a moment of quiet. Hundreds of miles, organized, repeated, sustained. The textbook picture before these finds was modest. Stonehenge was understood as a regional ceremonial site, impressive in ambition but essentially local in its community. Builders from nearby settlements dragging stones, farming families gathering for seasonal ritual. A remarkable achievement, certainly, but a contained one. The blue stones complicate that picture on their own terms. Stonehenge's inner ring of standing stones originated in the Preseli Hills of Wales, approximately 225 kilometers from the Wiltshire Plain. They were quarried, moved, and erected, most likely beginning around 3000 BCE, and precisely how they were transported, overland, by water, or some combination, remains experimentally unresolved to this day. Researchers have tried rafts, sledges, and timber rollers in controlled trials, and no single method has reproduced the feat convincingly at scale. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The stone transport and the feasting evidence are not two separate curiosities. They are two lines of the same document, and that document describes something much closer to organized infrastructure than to a local community project. Cattle from Scotland arriving at Durrington Walls are not a side effect of proximity. They are evidence of coordination across tribal boundaries, seasonal calendars, shared purpose, and logistical planning sustained across generations. This means the social architecture required to build and maintain Stonehenge predates writing, predates coinage, predates any institution archaeologists would formally call a state, and yet it functioned. People across the British Isles knew where to go, when to arrive, and what to bring. Some researchers argue this implies a form of political or religious authority capable of commanding effort at a continental scale. Mainstream archaeology does not go quite that far, preferring terms like dispersed voluntary cooperation around shared cosmology. The distinction matters, but both readings point in the same direction. Organized complex, continent-spanning human behavior, long before the civilization's history books, tend to treat as the opening chapter. The skeptic's objection has a shape. Distant cattle bones could simply reflect opportunistic trading between neighboring groups, the animal passing from hand to hand across short exchanges until it arrived far from its origin, with no single mind overseeing the journey. Parker Pearson's team considered precisely that. The isotope data clusters at sites directly associated with Stonehenge's construction and feasting peaks, not scattered across unrelated settlements, which argues against casual drift and toward directed movement with a destination in mind. Then there is Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, where the German Archaeological Institute's geophysical surveys, conducted from around 2003 onward, revealed that the excavated enclosures represent perhaps a fraction of the full site, with 16 to 20 additional circular structures still buried beneath the hill, all dating to roughly 9,600 BCE or earlier. The pattern holds across millennia and continents. Organized effort, monumental in scale, arriving earlier than expected. What makes this particularly haunting is the implication that the impulse to coordinate, to move cattle across kingdoms and stones across seas for a shared purpose rooted in belief, may not be a product of civilization at all. It may be what produced it. The stones at Stonehenge are still standing in their incomplete ring on Salisbury Plain. The feasting bones are still catalogued in laboratory drawers. What drove hundreds of people to move a living animal from Scotland to Wiltshire and offer it at a monument generation after generation is still unanswered. Number 9, Newgrange's sealed chamber, and the problem of a door locked from the outside. In 1963, archaeologist Michael O'Kelly began a meticulous excavation of the megalithic passage tomb at Newgrange, County Meath, on the eastern bank of the River Boyne in Ireland. He had worked sites before. Nothing prepared him for what the mathematics of this one implied. The monument itself is staggering in scale. A circular mound roughly 80 meters across, faced with white quartzite, enclosing a stone-lined passage 19 meters long that leads to a corbelled inner chamber. Radiocarbon dating places its construction at approximately 3,200 BCE. That makes Newgrange older than the Great Pyramid at Giza, by roughly 6 centuries older than Stonehenge's final phase by several hundred years. The chamber sits in precise astronomical alignment. Above the entrance, the builders fitted a narrow rectangular roof box, a deliberate architectural feature that serves no structural purpose. Once a year, at the winter solstice sunrise, a shaft of light enters that roof box and travels the full length of the passage to illuminate the floor of the inner chamber. The window of illumination lasts approximately 17 minutes before the angle shifts and darkness returns. It happens on no other morning of the year. The builders achieved this without written calculation, without metal instruments, and without a single degree of error across 19 meters of carefully graded stone. This means centuries of astronomical observation preceded the construction. The orientation is not approximate, it is exact. Someone watched the horizon at this location across multiple generations, recorded the precise azimuth of the winter solstice sun, and then translated that knowledge into a structure of enormous quarried stone. The textbook account of this period describes small farming communities in Neolithic Ireland capable of collective labor, but essentially local in their organization, without the coordinating institutions later associated with states or cities. Newgrange broadly fits within that picture. It is a passage tomb, used for the dead. Several human remains were recovered from the inner chamber. Nothing extraordinary by the standard reading. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Shortly after the monument was completed, around 3000 BCE, the entrance was deliberately sealed. A massive decorated curbstone was placed across the threshold. The passage itself was blocked. Access to the chamber, to the roof box, to the 17-minute solar event the builders had spent decades engineering with absolute precision. All of it was intentionally closed off. Not by collapse, not by neglect, by design. This means the people who built Newgrange did not intend to use it indefinitely. They built a perfect instrument, used it for some terminal purpose, and then bricked themselves out of it forever. The mainstream interpretation holds that this reflects a ritual practice of finality, a monument completed, a ceremony performed, a threshold permanently closed as a sacred act. That explanation is reasonable. Mainstream archaeologists accept it as the most coherent reading of the evidence. But the implication sits uneasily alongside our assumptions about why organized societies build things. Modern institutions build to endure and to be used. Cathedrals remain open. Observatories keep their telescopes pointed at the sky. The idea that a community would invest generations of coordinated labor into a solar instrument and then seal it permanently after a single ritual use suggests a conception of sacred time and sacred ending that has no easy parallel in later civilization. Some researchers argue this points to a belief system in which certain thresholds once crossed could never be revisited, a cosmology of irreversible moments. That interpretation remains debated. Karahan Tepe, a site in Şanlıurfa province in Turkey, excavated systematically only from 2019 onward under researcher Necmi Caral, shows carved pillars shaped to resemble human torsos, with hands resting on abdomens, bodies without faces, figures without names, present but permanently withheld. It is a different culture, a different millennium. The pattern of deliberate concealment is the same. What makes this particularly haunting is the suggestion that organized human societies were already capable of this level of intentional architectural closure long before the civilization history books treat as the starting line that the impulse to build and then to seal and to walk away forever may be older than writing, older than bronze, older than the very idea of recorded time. The decorated curbstone at Newgrange is still there. The roof box still admits the solstice light each December, traveling down a passage that no one was ever meant to enter again. What was completed inside the chamber on the day the builders walked away for the last time is still unknown. Number 8. Malta's vanished builders and the silence they left behind. In 1827, the antiquarian Giorgio Grognier de Vassay stood at the ruined limestone walls of Gantija on the small island of Gozo, and began making the first systematic sketches of what he recognized as something far older than any ruin Malta was supposed to contain. The site had been known to local farmers for generations. No one had yet grasped what it meant. What Grognet was drawing were the oldest freestanding stone structures on Earth. The temples of Gantija date to approximately 3600 BCE. That number needs a moment. They were already ancient when the first stone was placed at Stonehenge. They were standing, complete and in use, before the Egyptian pyramids existed at all. The walls rise to several meters in places, built from coralline limestone blocks weighing several tons each, shaped and fitted without metal tools, without the wheel, and without any written record of who decided to build them or why. The population of Malta at the time is estimated at fewer than 10,000 people. 10,000? That is a small market town, raising monuments that no modern construction firm would take on lightly, on an island with no large timber, limited fresh water, and no obvious surplus economy to spare laborers from the work of staying alive. Yet across Malta and Gozo, at least 30 temple structures from this period have been identified, each one oriented with apparent astronomical intent, each one built to last. The textbook picture before serious excavation began treated Malta as a quiet backwater, a place that received cultural ideas drifting across the Mediterranean from larger civilizations. The temples shattered that picture. This was not a community borrowing sophistication from elsewhere. This was a society generating it independently on a small island, earlier than almost anywhere else on record. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Around 2500 BCE, the temple-building civilization simply stopped. Not declined gradually, not absorbed into a neighboring culture, not overrun by an identifiable invader. Stopped. The temples were abandoned. The population that built them either vanished or was replaced, and mainstream archaeology has found no clear evidence of invasion, no mass epidemic burial record, no sudden environmental catastrophe sufficient to explain a complete civilizational disappearance. A different people, the Bronze Age inhabitants of Malta, eventually occupied the island, but the connection between them and the temple builders is not established. The identity of the original builders remains technically unknown. Some researchers argue for severe resource depletion over centuries, others point to possible climate shifts. The honest answer is that no single explanation has achieved consensus. This means the first chapter of Maltese history is also a closed book. A society capable of coordinating thousands of labor hours, of aligning stone chambers to celestial events, of sustaining a building program across centuries, left no descendants willing or able to remember them. They are not a mystery in the romantic sense. They are a gap. This connects to something larger and genuinely uncomfortable. If an organized, architecturally sophisticated society could emerge on a small island before the civilization's history books treat as the starting line and then vanish, leaving almost no cultural trace, the assumption that civilizational progress is linear and cumulative begins to look like a convenience rather than a documented fact. Civilizations, the evidence here suggests, are not permanent achievements moving steadily forward. They are experiments. Some experiments simply end. What makes this particularly haunting is the combination of ambition and silence, a people who built structures intended to endure forever, and who are themselves entirely gone, with no myth, no name, no surviving language to identify them by, only the stone. The temples of Gantija are still standing on Gozo, their threshold stones worn smooth, their inner chambers open to the same Mediterranean sky the builders watched. The stones are still there, holding their orientation, keeping whatever appointment the builders set them to keep. Who gave the order to stop building and where those people went is still one of the quietest unanswered questions in European prehistory. Number 7. The Jiroft discovery and a civilization hiding in plain sight. In 2001, catastrophic floods along the Halil River in Kerman Province, southeastern Iran, eroded the banks and exposed ancient buried chambers. Looters arrived before archaeologists did. They pulled carved stone vessels from the ground and sold them across international markets, and the objects began appearing in private collections before a single excavation permit had been filed. The Iranian archaeologist Yusef Majidzadeh recognized what the looted pieces represented and moved quickly. He secured formal excavation rights and began digging at the site near the modern city of Jiroft. What emerged from the trenches was not a minor regional outpost. The physical evidence was staggering in its density and sophistication. The chlorite vessels recovered from Jiroft, dark green stone carved with interlocking mythological scenes of serpents, eagles, and composite creatures, were not crude or experimental. They were finished, confident objects produced by artisans who had clearly inherited generations of symbolic tradition. Radiocarbon and stratigraphic dating placed the primary occupation layer at approximately 2500 BCE. One excavation season alone yielded thousands of fragmentary carved pieces, and Majidzadeh reported the presence of monumental mud brick architecture across a site extending several kilometers along the riverbank. Several of the vessels carried incised marks that some researchers classify as a writing system independent of Mesopotamian cuneiform, though that specific claim remains contested and mainstream archaeology has not yet reached consensus. Before Jiroft surfaced, the textbook map of Bronze Age urban civilization ran along familiar rivers: Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, Egypt along the Nile, the Indus Valley, where cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in modern Pakistan supported an estimated population of up to 5 million people by 2500 BCE, making the Indus civilization the largest of the 4 recognized riverine cultures by geographic extent. China along the Yellow River. Southeastern Iran appeared in that picture only as peripheral a supplier of raw materials to greater centers, not a center itself. And this is where the timeline stops making sense. Jiroft did not look peripheral. The mythological imagery on its carved vessels shared visual motifs with Mesopotamian iconography, but was not derived from it in any straightforward way, suggesting parallel symbolic development rather than simple borrowing. Majidzadeh argued that Jiroft may represent the legendary land of Aratta, a sophisticated urban power referenced in early Sumerian texts as a distant rival, though mainstream archaeology treats that specific identification as speculative and unconfirmed. The architecture, the craft specialization, the implied trade networks reaching from Central Asia to the Persian Gulf, these were not the marks of a village culture absorbed into someone else's story. The skeptical position holds that Jiroft is simply a regional culture, absorbed into the broader Mesopotamian sphere, rather than evidence of a truly independent civilization. That position is reasonable and not dishonest, but the carved chlorite vessels do not read as provincial imitation. The symbolic grammar on those stones has its own internal logic, its own recurring figures, its own compositional rules, and it was producing that grammar at the same moment Mesopotamia was producing its own, roughly 5,000 years ago, with no clear line of inheritance running between them. This means the number of genuinely independent urban cultures active in 2500 BCE may be larger than the standard 4. It means the map drawn by 20th century scholarship may have missed an entire node in the ancient network. And it raises the same uncomfortable problem surfaced by other finds, including the Vinča culture of the Central Balkans, where artisans between approximately 5,500 BCE and 4,500 BCE incised over 700 standardized marks onto ceramic vessels. Marks that some researchers classify as proto-writing, predating Sumerian script, though that classification is disputed and not accepted by most specialists. The pattern, site after site, is of organized symbolic behavior, appearing earlier and more widely than the conventional model predicted. What makes this particularly haunting is that Jiroft was not buried by catastrophe or hidden by design. It was sitting beneath Iranian farmland, centimeters below the surface, until a flood and a wave of illegal digging brought it forward in a single season. The carved vessels are still in collections and storage facilities, their mythological figures still locked in scenes no scholar has fully decoded. The excavation at Jiroft is still ongoing, and the mud brick walls still extend further than any team has yet followed them. The first draft of the ancient world had no entry for this place, and the revision is not finished. Number 6. Çatalhöyük's Living Dead, where the floor held secrets. In 1958, British archaeologist James Mellart was surveying the Konya Plain in central Turkey when a low mound rising from flat farmland stopped him. Local villagers called it Çatalhöyük, the forked mound. Mellart began cutting trenches into its surface, and what came up from the earth was not what anyone had prepared for. The settlement beneath that mound had housed up to 8,000 people. It ran continuously from approximately 7,500 BCE to 5,700 BCE, nearly 2,000 years of unbroken occupation on the same patch of ground. The structures were packed so tightly together that there were no streets at all. Residents climbed wooden ladders and entered their homes through hatches cut into the roofs. Smoke, children, livestock, tools, and sleeping bodies all moved through those ceiling openings. The floors were clean, smooth, and repeatedly refinished with white plaster. They looked almost ceremonial. And underneath them, pressed into the earth, directly below where families slept and ate, were the bones of the dead. This was not accidental burial. The dead were placed deliberately beneath the floors of the rooms their relatives continued to use. Skulls were sometimes exhumed long after burial, coated in fresh layers of plaster, shaped back toward the appearance of a face, and then circulated between households as objects of apparent significance. A skull might leave one home and appear in another. The reason is not recorded anywhere. The textbook expectation, before Çatalhöyük entered the record fully, was that organized communal life of this scale belonged to societies with temples, priests, and writing. Civilizations that came later, in Mesopotamia and Egypt, where the dead were moved away from the living and placed in designated ground. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Çatalhöyük predates those civilizations by thousands of years, and yet it was already organizing thousands of people, managing shared space, encoding memory into architecture, and maintaining elaborate ritual practices that required collective agreement and effort. This was not a transitional camp. It was a functioning proto-urban society operating at scale before the starting line that history textbooks have traditionally drawn. Ian Hodder, who led systematic excavations at Çatalhöyük from 1993 onward, documented something that deepened the puzzle further. The inhabitants periodically plastered over their painted walls entirely not to repair them, but to erase them. New scenes were then painted on the fresh surface. Some walls show evidence of this cycle repeated dozens of times. Hodder and his team argue this reflects deliberate ritual renewal, a structured decision to end one visual record and begin another, rather than simple maintenance. This means the community was collectively managing meaning, deciding what images should persist and which should be covered and forgotten. This means the boundary between architecture and ritual had already collapsed, or perhaps had never been separate in the first place. It means memory itself was treated as something that could be physically renewed, layered, and controlled. The skull beneath the floor, replastered and passed between households, was not a relic of chaos. It was a managed relationship with the dead, governed by rules that the living agreed upon and maintained. Mainstream archaeology does not dispute the site or its dates. What remains genuinely open is the specific belief system that organized these practices, what the recirculated skulls meant to those who handled them, and what the painted walls were understood to contain before they were erased. What makes this particularly haunting is that Çatalhöyük forces a re-examination of when organized human society actually began, not as a question about dates alone, but as a question about what counts as civilization in the first place. A community that collectively manages death, regulates memory, and maintains ritual renewal across 2 millennia is doing something that history books have traditionally reserved for much later peoples. The mound on the Konya Plain is still there, and excavations under Hodder's long-running project are still producing new layers. The plastered skulls are still held in museum storage, their reshaped faces looking toward no particular ceiling. What the living believed they were preserving when they passed those skulls from house to house remains after decades of careful excavation, genuinely unknown. Number 5, Caral and the quipu, and a mystery older than history supposed. In 1994, archaeologist Ruth Shady Solis was surveying the dry terraces of the Supi Valley in coastal Peru when the scale of what lay beneath the desert surface began to reveal itself. She had worked Peruvian sites before. Nothing had prepared her for this. What her team uncovered was not a settlement, it was a city. The ancient site of Caral sits roughly 180 kilometers north of Lima, and radiocarbon dating placed its construction at approximately 2600 BCE, making it the oldest known urban center in the entire Americas. 6 massive platform mounds rise from the valley floor, the largest standing nearly 18 meters high, its stepped stone faces still holding their general form after more than 4.5 millennia of desert wind. Amphitheaters curve between the mounds, their rounded walls shaped to gather and focus sound in ways that suggest organized public ceremony rather than accidental gathering. Residential quarters fan outward from the ceremonial core in a planned arrangement that implies zoning authority, and a population counted not in dozens but in thousands. The city also held sunken circular plazas, each one excavated several meters below the surrounding ground level, where gatherings of considerable size could be organized, observed, and controlled from the raised platforms above. Caral was functioning as a full metropolitan center at the precise moment Egypt's Old Kingdom pharaohs were raising their own stone monuments on the far side of the world. That parallel deserves a slow look. 2 civilizations, separated by an ocean and an entire hemisphere, both organizing labor at monumental scale, both constructing ceremonial architecture designed to impress and to endure, and neither apparently aware the other existed. The textbook position, before Shady Solis published her findings, held that complex urban life in the Americas began somewhere around 1500 BCE at the earliest. Caral moved that line back by more than 1,000 years, and it moved it without ambiguity. But the mounds alone were not the most consequential discovery. Among the objects recovered during the Caral excavations were knotted string devices. Quipus, the Inca Empire, whose political structure collapsed under Spanish pressure in the 16th century CE, had used quipus to encode numerical data, census figures, tribute records, and administrative accounts through carefully arranged patterns of knots tied along hanging cords of different colors and thicknesses. Historians had largely treated the quipu as a relatively late invention, something that emerged from the specific pressures of imperial Andean bureaucracy. The specimens recovered from Caral destroyed that assumption. They pushed the tradition of knotted string record-keeping back to at least 2600 BCE, indicating that the Norte Chico civilization was encoding information in this form nearly 2,000 years before the cultures most commonly associated with the technology. Some researchers argue this points to an unbroken tradition of non-written information encoding along the Peruvian coast spanning close to 4,000 years. A continuous thread of administrative practice running from the desert mounds of Caral all the way to the storehouses of the Inca. Mainstream archaeology treats that continuity as plausible, but not yet fully demonstrated. noting that the evidentiary record between the two endpoints remains incomplete and that independent reinvention cannot be ruled out entirely. What the Caral quipus suggest, even under the most cautious reading, is that the Norte Chico civilization was not improvising. It was not borrowing from neighbors or waiting for some diffused cultural impulse to arrive from elsewhere. It was generating its own information technology, independently at the same horizon where literate civilizations were emerging in Egypt and Mesopotamia, using a medium those distant cultures never developed. The parallel emergence carries real weight. Complexity, the evidence implies, does not radiate outward from a single origin point to peoples waiting in darkness at the margins of history. It arises wherever population density, resource stability, and accumulated social knowledge converge and pass a threshold together. Caral showed no evidence of organized warfare in its earliest excavated layers. No defensive perimeter walls have been identified. No weapons caches, no mass burial pits, no burned destruction horizons from enemy attack. Some researchers argue this pattern suggests a society structured primarily around trade and shared ritual rather than military competition. Though the complete picture of Norte Chico political life remains under active study and debate, and absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. The truly unsettling aspect is not that Caral existed. It is that it existed unrecognized for so long, sitting in open desert, its 6 great mounds mistaken for natural hills by earlier surveys, its residential quarters weathering quietly in plain sight. A city that organized a river valley, encoded its records in knotted string, and gathered its population inside stone amphitheaters, remaining effectively invisible to every history written after it. Caral is still there in the Supa Valley. The platform mounds cast long shadows across the dry ground each evening, just as they did when the city was alive. The quipus recovered from its excavations are held in Peruvian collections, their knots tied with purpose and precision by hands that understood exactly what each loop and cross and clustering meant. What those strings were counting, what debts, what harvests, what ceremonies, what names, what losses, across nearly 5,000 years of silence, no one has yet been able to say. Number 4. Atlit-Yam underwater, where an entire drowned town waits. In 1984, marine archaeologist Ehud Galili was conducting a routine coastal survey off the shores of northern Israel when his team's equipment began returning something unexpected from the seafloor near the town of Atlit. The shapes were too regular, too deliberate. They descended to look. What they found was a settlement. Not fragments, not scattered debris. A settlement, with walls, with floors, with wells still lined in stone, sitting in roughly 10 meters of Mediterranean water, a short distance from the modern Israeli coast. The site of Atlit-Yam covers an area of roughly 40,000 square meters on the seafloor, containing the preserved outlines of rectangular buildings, storage pits, and a semicircular arrangement of 7 large stones standing around a freshwater spring, which researchers interpret as a ritual monument or gathering place. It was submerged by rising sea levels around 6,900 BCE, meaning it had been sitting beneath the Mediterranean for nearly 9,000 years before Galili's survey passed overhead. 9,000 years. The physical objects recovered from Atlit-Yam are remarkable in their completeness and variety. Bone tools, fishing equipment, animal remains, and the articulated skeletons of the people who once lived there were all preserved under the sediment and water. Among those skeletal remains, researchers identified the earliest confirmed case of tuberculosis in a human skeleton anywhere on the archaeological record, found in a woman and young child buried together, suggesting the disease was already present in coastal communities long before any civilization that history books treat as a beginning. Radiocarbon dating of the organic material confirmed the site's age and the integrity of the finds. This was not a ceremonial deposit or a temporary camp. It was a home. The textbook timeline, as it stood before discoveries like this one, placed the emergence of organized human settlement firmly inland and firmly recent, anchored to the river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt from roughly 4,000 BCE onward. Coastal or near-coastal populations were understood as mobile, seasonal, and architecturally simple. Permanent wells, stone circles, and communal burial rites did not fit that picture for a community living 9,000 years ago. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Atlit-Yam is not an isolated anomaly. It is one of dozens of submerged prehistoric sites now identified along coastlines across the world, each one representing a community that was swallowed by the sea as glacial melt raised ocean levels in the millennia following the last ice age. The scale of what was lost is almost impossible to calculate. Thousands of kilometers of habitable coastline, some of the most resource-rich and densely settled land available to prehistoric populations, now sitting beneath tens of meters of water and largely unexamined. This means the archaeological record that scholars have been reading for 2 centuries is profoundly incomplete in a specific and directional way. The evidence preserved on dry land captures only the inland portion of prehistoric life, and possibly a minority portion at that. Every model of how quickly human societies developed, how early they organized themselves around permanent structures, how early disease moved through communities, all of it is built on a sample that excludes the drowned coastlines entirely. Off Yonaguni Island in the Ryukyu chain of Japan, a stepped rock formation lying approximately 25 meters below sea level has prompted serious debate, with researcher Masaki Kimura arguing it represents a man-made platform dating to at least 8,000 BCE, though mainstream geology disputes this and considers the formation natural. The disagreement itself is instructive. The threshold for what counts as plausible keeps shifting as more sea floor is mapped. On dry land, the megalithic alignments at Carnac in Brittany, France, show that by around 4,500 BCE communities were erecting more than 3,000 standing stones in parallel rows stretching over 4 kilometers. The largest such alignment on Earth demonstrating that organizational capacity on a massive scale existed far earlier than older models allowed. What was already happening closer to the shore in the communities the sea took remains almost entirely unknown. What makes this particularly haunting is that Atlit-Yam's tuberculosis case places organized sedentary disease-affected human life at a moment the standard timeline had reserved for scattered hunter-gatherers, and it survived only because the sediment was gentle and Galileo's survey happened to pass in that direction. The stone circle at Atlit-Yam is still standing on the seafloor, its 7 uprights arranged around a spring that no longer flows with fresh water. The wells are still there, lined by hands that understood permanence. What proportion of the human story lies similarly submerged beyond the reach of any shovel, waiting for survey equipment that may or may not ever come? That question remains entirely unanswered. Number 3. Nabta Playa's desert astronomers, and the desert keeps a secret. In 1974, archaeologist Fred Wendorf was conducting a systematic survey of the western desert of Egypt, moving through a vast and largely featureless basin called Nabta Playa, when his team began pulling stone slabs from the sand that had no business being there. The stones were not scattered, they were arranged. Upright megaliths stood in a rough circle roughly 4 meters across, positioned with a deliberateness that stopped the survey cold. Wendorf had been cataloging nomadic campsites and seasonal lakebeds. This was something else entirely. The physical evidence at Nabta Playa resists easy dismissal. The stone circle itself dates to approximately 4,500 BCE, established through radiocarbon dating of organic material recovered from the surrounding sediment layers. That single date carries enormous weight. Scattered across the broader basin, researchers eventually mapped more than 30 megalithic structures in various configurations, some standing upright and some lying flat, constructed from sandstone blocks that required coordinated labor to move. The alignment of several gateway stones within the circle corresponds to the rising sun at the summer solstice, an event critical to cattle herders tracking seasonal rains in a landscape that was, at that period, semi-arid grassland rather than barren desert. 4,500 years before the Common Era. The number settles slowly. The people who built this left no cities, no grain stores, no writing. The textbook understanding of astronomical monument building pointed firmly towards settled, stratified societies, places with surplus food, specialist labor, and hierarchical organization capable of directing long-term construction projects. Stonehenge, the benchmark, dates to roughly 3000 BCE. The conventional story treated monuments of that complexity as the products of civilization already in motion. Nomadic cattle herders wandering a Saharan basin were not part of that story. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Sometime around 3500 BCE, according to the work of researcher Thomas Brophy and others who have studied the site's deeper stratigraphy, several of the most elaborate megalithic features at Nabta Playa were not abandoned. They were buried. Stone slabs were placed deliberately over certain structures, and sand mounds were raised above them in an arrangement that archaeologists describe as intentional concealment of the complex's deepest ritual elements. These were not structures that collapsed or were forgotten. They were covered on purpose by people who understood what they were covering and why it should no longer be visible. This means the builders possessed not only the astronomical literacy to track solstice alignments across generations, but also a ritual framework sophisticated enough to demand that certain knowledge be hidden rather than displayed. That distinction matters enormously. Hiding something requires a concept of inside and outside, of knowledge that belongs to some and not to others. It implies hierarchy, memory, and intention extending beyond a single human lifetime. Mainstream archaeology accepts the construction and broad solar alignment at Nabta Playa as genuine. The specific interpretations of deliberate concealment and the precise astronomical readings proposed by Brophy, including claims of stellar alignments to specific stars thousands of years earlier, remain controversial, and several researchers dispute them as overreach beyond the available evidence. What the site firmly establishes, without controversy, is that organized, repeated, astronomically informed construction was underway among mobile pastoralists at least 1,000 years before Stonehenge broke ground. The implication for the through line of this entire series is direct and uncomfortable. Astronomical literacy and ritual architecture do not appear here as byproducts of civilization already built. They appear as something that preceded it, or perhaps, in some form, enabled it. The truly unsettling aspect is that Nabta Playa only came to sustained archaeological attention because a survey team happened to cross that particular basin in that particular year. The Western Desert is large. The number of similar basins that have never been walked systematically remains unknown. The stone circle is still there, half reclaimed by wind-drifted sand, oriented to a sunrise that returns every June whether anyone is watching or not. The buried structures lie beneath their deliberate mounds concealed by hands that clearly believed the concealment would hold. What those herders understood about the sky, about time, and about what knowledge deserved to be hidden, that remains as yet unanswered. Number 2. Göbekli Tepe's buried secret, and the mystery deepens. In 1994, Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist surveying the arid limestone ridges of Şanlıurfa province in southeastern Turkey, noticed something that earlier surveys had dismissed as a Byzantine cemetery. The shaped stones jutting from the hillside were not medieval grave markers. They were something far older and far larger than anyone standing on that dusty ridge was prepared to accept. What Schmidt's team began pulling from the earth defied the established order of human development. The site at Göbekli Tepe contained T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them reaching 5.5 meters tall, arranged in deliberate circular enclosures, carved and set with extraordinary precision. Radiocarbon dating placed the construction at approximately 9,600 BCE. That single number rewrote a chapter of human prehistory that scholars had considered largely settled. 9,600 years before the Common Era. Let that land. Stonehenge, which most people already consider astonishingly ancient, would not be raised for another 6,000 years after the builders of Göbekli Tepe had already finished their work. The reliefs carved into those pillars, foxes, vultures, scorpions, and the deeply unsettling image of headless humans, showed a symbolic vocabulary rich enough to suggest sustained ritual thinking, coordinated labor, and a community organized around something beyond simple daily survival. The textbook timeline had long maintained a clear sequence. First came settled agriculture, then surplus food, then the leisure and social complexity that allowed monumental construction to emerge. Göbekli Tepe did not fit that sequence. The site shows no evidence of permanent settlement. No granaries, no cultivated fields in the surrounding soil layers from the period of its construction. The hunters and gatherers who raised these pillars apparently organized massive collective effort without the agricultural foundation that mainstream archaeology had treated as a prerequisite. And this is where the timeline stops making sense. If a mobile, pre-agricultural population in the hills above the Harran Plain could design, quarry, transport, and erect 5.5-meter limestone pillars arranged in geometrically considered enclosures, then the accepted model, complexity follows farming, cannot be universal. Some researchers now argue the relationship may have run in reverse, that the demands of feeding the labor force gathered at a sacred site like Göbekli Tepe may have pushed local populations toward deliberate cultivation. That argument remains active and contested. Mainstream archaeology does not yet treat it as settled. Then there is the burial itself. Around 8000 BCE, roughly 16 centuries after the complex reached its known peak of activity, the builders returned. They did not abandon Göbekli Tepe the way populations abandon settlements when resources fail or conflict forces movement. They buried it, deliberately, methodically. They filled the enclosures with hundreds of tons of rubble, animal bones, and flint tools, entombing their own construction in a backfill so dense and so thorough that it preserved everything beneath it for 10,000 years. The German Archaeological Institute's excavations, ongoing since that first survey in 1994, found the pillars in extraordinary condition. Paint pigments still adhering to the stone, carved reliefs intact, the images of foxes and vultures as legible as the day the last shovelful of rubble covered them. This means the burial was not destruction. It was preservation of a very deliberate kind. The act implies planning across generations. It implies that those who carried out the backfilling understood that what lay beneath had lasting significance. Significance worth protecting from time, from weather, from other hands. That is not the behavior of a population living entirely in the present moment of survival. That is the behavior of people who understood inheritance, who thought about what they were leaving behind, and who made a calculated choice about how to leave it. What makes this particularly haunting is that the instinct encoded in that burial, conceal the sacred so it endures, is the same instinct archaeologists rely upon every time they find a deliberately sealed chamber, a carefully interred object, a stone face buried face down to protect it. Göbekli Tepe suggests that instinct is not a product of civilization. It may be one of civilization's oldest roots. The enclosures at Göbekli Tepe are still there beneath the Şanlıurfa hillside, only partially excavated, the majority of the site untouched and waiting under its ancient deliberate fill. Geophysical surveys suggest further structures remain unexcavated, their precise arrangement still unknown. The people who raised those pillars and then sealed them with such care understood something about permanence and sacred knowledge that we are only beginning, in fragments, to read. And what they ultimately believed worth preserving still has no full answer. Number 1. The Vulture Stone's star map and the stone itself may be the oldest clock ever carved. In 2017, Martin Sweatman, a researcher at the University of Edinburgh, was analyzing the carved reliefs on Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey when a pattern began to emerge from the animals and symbols cut into the limestone surface 12,000 years ago. Pillar 43 is one of the great T-shaped monoliths at the site, standing in the enclosure archaeologists call Layer 3. Its surface crowded with birds, reptiles, and one prominent vulture raising a wing above a circle that some researchers now read as the sun. The pillar is roughly 2 meters tall, weathered but largely intact, its carvings pressed into the stone with a control and intentionality that speaks of sustained effort and shared purpose. Sweatman's analysis, published in the journal Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry, proposed that the arrangement of animal symbols on Pillar 43 corresponds to specific star constellations as they would have appeared in the sky around 10,950 BCE, a date that falls precisely at the close of the Younger Dryas period, 10,950 years before the Common Era. Let that land. The standard account of organized human symbolic thought placed its earliest coherent expression several thousand years after Göbekli Tepe itself, with Göbekli Tepe already representing a startling upward revision of that timeline when Klaus Schmidt's excavations began there in 1994. Before Schmidt's trenches opened the hilltop, the textbook position held that monumental communal construction required settled agriculture as a foundation, that people had to grow food before they could organize labor, surplus, and shared meaning at any significant scale. Göbekli Tepe shook that assumption. The site predates the earliest confirmed agricultural settlements in the region by at least a millennium, suggesting that the hunters and foragers who raised its pillars possessed a degree of social organization the model had not predicted. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Even accepting Göbekli Tepe as the work of organized hunter-gatherers, mainstream archaeology had treated the carvings as ritual imagery. Powerful, yes, but essentially symbolic in the way cave paintings are symbolic, without implying astronomical literacy or precise calendrical recording. Sweatman's interpretation cuts directly against that reading, arguing instead that the artisans who carved Pillar 43 were tracking the night sky with enough precision to record the position of the sun against specific star fields at a particular moment in deep time, and that the moment they chose was catastrophic, a proposed comet impact or fragmentation event that some researchers associate with a rapid cooling episode at the boundary of the Younger Dryas. Mainstream archaeology treats this interpretation as contested and unproven. The comet impact hypothesis for the Younger Dryas cooling event itself remains disputed in the broader scientific literature, with no confirmed impact crater of the right age yet identified. What the physical evidence does confirm without dispute is this: the people at Göbekli Tepe were watching the sky in an organized, collective, and apparently symbolic way long before any society we typically call civilized walked the earth. The implications branch outward in every direction. Roughly 3,000 years after the proposed date encoded in Pillar 43 excavations at Ain Ghazal near modern Amman in Jordan revealed 32 plaster statues deliberately cached in two sealed pits around 7,250 BCE, the largest known collection of prehistoric statuary in the Near East, recovered by Gary Rollofson's team and demonstrating that the impulse to make, preserve, and conceal objects of communal meaning persisted across millennia and geography with a consistency that does not look accidental. By approximately 6,500 BCE, the community at Lepenski Vir on the Serbian bank of the Danube, excavated by Dragoslav Srejovic in the Iron Gates Gorge, had constructed trapezoidal stone-floored buildings and carved large sandstone figures combining human and fish features, some of the earliest known monumental sculpture in Europe, produced by people who, like the builders at Göbekli Tepe, are not supposed to have had the social infrastructure for such things. Taken together, these three sites, Göbekli Tepe's carved star map, the sealed statues of Ain Ghazal, the hybrid figures of Lepenski Vir, describe not an isolated moment of early genius, but a long, distributed, and continuous human conversation about the sky, the dead, and the sacred. The truly unsettling aspect is not that one pillar might encode a date from 12,000 years ago, but that if it does, the people carving it already possess the conceptual vocabulary to consider that a particular night sky was worth recording permanently in stone for whoever came later, which means they understood in some functional sense that there would be a later. The Vulture Stone is still there on the hilltop in southern Turkey, inside its partially excavated enclosure, surrounded by undug ground that geophysical surveys suggest holds further structures not yet touched. The 32 plaster faces of Ain Ghazal still look outward from museum cases in Amman, and the fish-human figures of Lepenski Vir still occupy their place beside a river that has not changed course. Whether the starting line of organized human thought sits at Sumer, at Göbekli Tepe, or somewhere further back in a shadow the shovels have not yet reached, that line is still moving, and the people who first drew it in stone are still waiting to be properly understood. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.